Hi there, Futures 101. I'm interviewing Thays Prado, who currently resides, I like saying that formal sort of thing, in Lisbon, in Portugal. Lisbon, fantastic city, really love it, except you have to walk up lots of hills. But apart from that, I really love it. And, I'm really happy to have Thays here because I've been following her adventures, you might say, in feminist futures online for quite some time, and she's produced a really lovely. Was you on your own, or did you were the editor for
Yeah,
these stories, Toast? Yeah.
yeah.
So she produced this beautiful online, free to download collection of stories from young women and so on. So I'm really here just to ask Toast, how did you get into futures first, and tell us a little bit of that story, and then what are the key things that you're working on now, and then we'll take it from there. So over to you, Toast, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for the invitation, Marcus. Yeah, so I think I had a quite a fragmented career up until I realized that futures was a field and not just a time or a word, a word.
Mm.
So I started my career as a journalist and did a lot of filmmaking, documentary filmmaking, and screenwriting on the side. And at some point, I was missing a lot the presence of women as the central subject and the central protagonist of my service as a professional. So I studied gender at the LSE. I worked for UN Women for almost 8 years. And developed my career as the gender expert. And as I was doing that, I was working with adolescent girls
Mhm.
and facilitating storytelling workshops with them.
Mm.
And when I was doing that, a lot of trauma would emerge in these stories, right? So we were talking about the river of life and the key moments that led them to the present. And then they were like owning their stories and understanding that they were more than their traumas. I was working with adolescent girls in very vulnerable communities, especially in Rio, but across Brazil, some refugee women in the border with Venezuela and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I was missing a component of the future, right? Because they would leave the workshop with a better sense of their lives up until now, but then what? So I started to research how to incorporate the future in my workshops, but I didn't understand up until then that the future was a field, with a whole history and an academic field and things like that. So that's when I realized, that this was a field and started to read a lot of toolkits and take free courses online and things like that. And that's how I incorporated the futures to a point that now I am developing this consultancy called Feminist Futures, where I combine the three components of my life into one, and I feel much more
Mm.
integrated now, right? So
Wonderful.
I use a lot of storytelling plus feminist principles or gender issues and futures as a methodology as well.
That's really interesting. And as you were telling that kind of evolution of your experience and your understanding of the need for futures, was there a moment where you suddenly bumped into futures in a way that it turned the lights on? Some people say they met somebody, they went to a workshop, or their boss introduced them to somebody. These are the sorts of stories that have been happening. How did you actually find out that futures was, and probably located within, let's say, we talked about Ivana Milojevic, for instance, what happened that brought those elements together for you?
Yeah, I just stumbled upon this podcast called Futures Hackers. They were doing like an online event. I think it was 2 days of events with several talks. And then I was like, oh, okay, so this is a thing. I would love to do this. I would love to do that. So that was my
Mm.
first moment with that. But then there was a second moment, which was I was already doing developing futures methods or applying futures methods with some clients.
Yeah.
And I had this feminist philanthropy collective group. And they were not super happy with the methods. They were like, but this is so linear, or this is so capitalist, or the values behind this method do not necessarily resonate with the values of these collective. And that's when we began together to explore what would a feminist version of those methods look like, right? So looking at non-linear versions of time and present, past, and future,
Yep.
and not even understanding like, oh, the past is something bad that you really need to get rid of so that you evolve. It's more like, okay, no, what's the value of the past? What coloniality did to our past that we actually need to recover and, regenerate in order to really manifest or realize the future that we want together.
That's very powerful, and so many lights are going off in my head because I mean, just very recently I was reading, you might have spotted it on LinkedIn, Frank Spencer's meditation on hospicing futurity. Did you see that?
Yeah, yes,
I mean, he's
yes.
talking about what, just exactly what you said, about the colonization of the mind, colonialism itself, and but not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, as we say in English, not denying coloniality or suppressing the wound, but actually acknowledging the wound so that we can move on in some way. Yeah, it's very interesting. So tell us then, how did this, so here you are, you're running a consultancy, you've integrated these dimensions of your life, which are all obviously part of who you are. We're multiple beings, we're not singular in any way.
Yeah.
Your beautiful collection of stories. Tell me about that. So, or tell the listener about that, please, so that we get a sense of
Yeah.
how they evolved for you, and for obviously for the young women you were working with.
Yeah. So one thing that I find really powerful when I'm working with adolescent girls is really to connect them with their desirable futures, right? Especially
Mm.
when they are young activists, which is the case of the girls in this collective. They feel quite hopeless at this point, right? Where we are seeing gender being so targeted and organizations working on gender issues having their funds reduced, and
Yeah.
these girls feeling quite not supported. So I wanted for them to first connect with this idea of the future that they want to see come true. So, and because this year we are celebrating the 30th anniversary of the Beijing Platform for Action, which is the most comprehensive document for women's rights in the world, I wanted to use this premise together with them. So we imagined, what if policymakers realized the Beijing Platform for Action, right?
Mm.
What if they really were committed to this document created 30 years ago? What would the world look like 30 years from now in
Mm.
2055, right? So we developed first a world building, what would be the consequences of them adopting this agenda, and then created characters living there. What would the life of one adolescent girl look like in that reality? And from the adolescent girls, we then created the plot, right? The kind of story arc. What would happen with these adolescent girls? And these young activists, they're not naive at all and not at all utopians. So
Okay.
they were
Yeah.
like, oh, okay, but many problems will continue. No, but in this story, I want to talk about my past as well. I want to talk about the challenges that I have now. They are very concerned about voicing, the struggles they are living right now.
Yeah.
So the stories happen in the future, in a future that is much, much better than the present that we have today. But it's very interesting because they point to the pitfalls, right?
Yep.
Sometimes it's about like, okay, so we advance gender overall, but then like these specific groups of women are left behind. There's one case of one story of a hijabi, a girl that uses a hijab, and then she realizes it's a future where we don't travel too much because of the carbon emissions. So people are living in their own countries, and she's living in Lebanon. Oh no, actually in Jordan. She's living
Yep.
in Jordan, and then she travels to Europe in 2055, and she realizes that she's being discriminated, and she doesn't understand because gender equality is now a reality in the world, right? But then she realizes that there was this mistaken association that if you are gender free, therefore you cannot use a hijab. And if
Yes,
you use a
that's right. Yeah.
hijab, you are discriminating. So you should be discriminated and things like that. So she's really creating with her story a provocation that yes, gender equality means that we are free to use whatever we want and express our visions, our religion, and our culture the way we
Mm.
want, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, there are several examples of that in the stories.
That's a fantastic example, actually, and the fact that they're not utopian sort of giddy stories is also really encouraging. One of the things that I've always felt about good feminist work is that it's very pragmatic. It's very grounded in the realities of lives, and that means it's also very sensitive to context. So the hijab, Jordan, and then identity there, as opposed to being a woman in Paris or somewhere. So I get all of that. So with your because you, and I'm intrigued by the name of your consulting. So it's Feminist Futures. Now, feminism tends to be somewhat ideological, can be quite it's quite critical of realities, but it's also quite a mixed field now, because you've got women of colour who are feminists, you've got LGBTQI feminists, you've got the whole queer sort of spectrum that's buying into or drawing on. How do you negotiate all of that? Because to me, it's really, really interesting, because I love ideas and I love the paradoxes that we end up with in life all the time. So I'm just interested to hear what you have to say about that, please.
Yeah, that's a good question. I have a very wide understanding of feminism. So to me, feminism is a really nice, desirable futures framework for the current moment, right? In the sense that through feminism, we will, yes, question the status quo, the power dynamics, the things that are just taken as for granted, right? And really understand like who gets to decide this, who's participating, whose voices are we hearing and considering and bringing together. But feminism also looks at the past, and valuing the ancestral knowledge, the knowledges of those women and girls who were completely destroyed by colonization, for example, and had really important values that were being held, but that keep still being held in many communities locally, right? So it's about understanding that the ancestrality continues through a lot of women and girls and men and boys, of course, as well. And at the same time, it's about dreaming about what we never experienced as a reality, So there is a sense of hope and equality and expansion that I quite like. And in my personal view, I think men can be feminists as well, which I think it's controversial. Some people would not agree with that. But to me, like feminism is really a framework, it's a paradigm through which you look at the world and you understand that everyone has a place, right? Everyone has a voice, and we should hold the paradoxes and the tensions so that we achieve conflict resolution. Because I don't understand conflict as necessarily a negative thing. It just means that you are seeing something and I'm seeing something. And therefore, maybe the best solution is when I acknowledge what I see, acknowledge what you see, and then we create something that is even better than what I was proposing on my own or you were proposing on your own. Right. So, and it's complex and it's very hard, but that's the kind of innovation that I really hope to see in the world as we move towards the future.
Yep. No, I think that I'm very happy with that kind of answer, and I feel myself very much in alignment with that kind of approach. It's about relationship, inclusivity, and about understanding, of course, the way power dynamics create spaces of silence. That's actually silence. Could be silencing the imagination, or it could be silencing a specific group in a community or whatever.
And everyone loses when someone is silent, right? Because then you're losing one perspective that is unique. So by bringing more people to the conversation, you're actually enriching the experience of all of us.
I've got two questions that come to mind just because sometimes these odd things pop into my head. One is, you're from Brazil and you're in Portugal, both are seriously Catholic countries. How do you negotiate faith traditions? Is it a problem in any way, or is it part of obviously it's a part of the enriching process as well, but there might be, I can imagine trying to talk feminism to certain Catholics that I might know, and because I've been to Brazil and I've been to Portugal, that might be difficult. Do you have those issues or not?
Yeah, as you said before, you used the word
You're grinning.
paradox. I think it's a paradox because sometimes, when you look at the work of some women's organizations to prevent or mitigate child marriage or female genital
Yeah.
mutilation and this kind of horrible practices against women and girls and sometimes against boys and men as well, if you don't count on the support of the religious leaders, you won't be able to go that
Hmm.
far, right?
Hmm.
So some religious leaders, because of their power and their influence in the communities, they are quite useful in that sense of like bringing the community together and really like reinterpreting or actualizing some of the things that have been, you know, teaching or
Yeah.
talking about to the current context. We have like in Latin America the Católica, the I would say in Portuguese, Católicas pelo Direito de Decidir, which is like Catholics for the right to decide, and they are very proactive in the sense of supporting women in abortion rights, for
Yeah.
example, right? So understanding that the lives of women are
Yeah.
so valuable and they are, losing their lives for unsafe abortions. So it really depends. I think we need to get rid of the stereotypes
Yeah.
and of the preconceptions if we want to come together and talk. We need everyone. It's not like, oh, then I'm going to exclude the religious leaders and do like this kind of secular society here and we are all good. I mean, there's good things in religion and problematic
Yeah.
things in religion, so as we have in the secularism as well, right? So
Absolutely
it's
agree.
about, again, bringing the different voices without necessarily having to
Mm.
convince each other, but really learning how can we be together in these
Mm.
multiple realities, these multiple presents that we live in.
I like that. No, I don't know if there's ever a real answer for these things. It's about negotiating, listening, respecting, and many things involved in it. The other one is, I guess, similar in some respects. One of the areas that I'm interested in is the way feminism is engaging environmentalism and ecological thinking.
Yeah.
Do you kind of weave those elements into your own work?
Yes, more and more. Now I'm, for instance, working with the UNFCCC and trying to bring again, like with the gender team, looking at how to bring more the gender component into the climate component and vice
Hmm.
versa,
Yeah,
because these
yeah,
two agendas are somewhat under threat right now,
yeah,
right? In certain dimensions of the world. And they are essential. I mean, women and girls, they are the most affected populations when there are like
mm,
climate emergencies, sometimes because of gender aspects, gender norms, right? So women and girls, they are less stimulated to learn how to swim. And then when there is a flood, more women and girls will
yeah,
die,
yeah,
because they are not equipped enough to
yeah,
to save their own
yeah,
lives.
yeah,
So in whatever situation, I think it's very important that we look at the situation with a gender perspective. And it might be, in some cases, men and boys will be disproportionately affected. And in many other situations, women and girls will be disproportionately affected. So again, like as with feminism, I think I like to apply a gender lens or do what we say gender mainstreaming,
yeah,
which is really understand how are women and girls being affected, how are men and boys being affected, what
yeah,
are their specific needs, so that the policies that we create, the mechanisms that we create, respond to those specific needs,
mm,
which
yeah,
are sometimes created because of their gender.
yeah, yeah. No, I hear you, and I think that, yeah, to me, again, it was more I, the complex nature of power and its involvement in, I guess, gender definitions, but also much broader than that, the way nature is understood, the way children are understood, ethnicities, of course, and so on. So, no, to me, I just was, I'm it's just happy to hear that the way you're approaching it, Thays, just makes me happy. I guess there's not, we should finish up relatively soon, but I'm thinking, what, I'm harking back to something you mentioned early on in our conversation, where you said you were sitting with these women groups and they were dissatisfied with the linearity, let's say, of the futures tools that you were using and so on.
Right.
Could you talk about one of those tools and maybe the way you messed with it to open it up
Mm.
in ways? Because I think it'd be very interesting to hear that.
Yeah, I mean, I can think about, for instance, the even the steep V framework, they were like, okay, but then you are like dividing society in this social, technological, economic. What
Yep.
about care? What about family? And I understand we could put everything under social, right? But then the
Yeah.
social category is quite big, and then you need nuances inside the social. So, for instance, in that case, we created new clusters to think
Mm,
about things that were more important for them, you know, which had to
okay.
do with this, with relationships, with solidarity, with family and care, and even the economy of care and things like that. When we look at the Three Horizons, for example, they don't really like the model of like, okay, so then the status quo will collapse and a new future will emerge. Actually, like there are so many realities happening at the same time. So we still use the futures,
The
the
three
Three
horizons. Yeah.
Horizon,
Yeah.
yeah, but in a more kind of like multiple realities that are happening at the same time. So yes, what we would like to reduce and what we would like to leverage, you know, and when we look at the seeds of the future, the beginning of the Horizon 3, it's not just like that they are small things happening. They are things that are very prominent in some places, right? So it's about, I think, understanding the tools in a different way. I remember looking at the toolkit of the Pacific community, if I'm not mistaken, and they talking about the futures triangle and how the Pacific community don't look at the past as a weight. On the contrary, the past is an anchor that really
Yeah.
encourages them to move towards the future, right? And
Yep.
nurture them in that sense. So I quite like that we don't use this idea of like, okay, so the future is something that we should achieve and it's something new and the past should be overcome, you know? I think
Mm.
it's more like it's a mixture of what are the components of society and of life and of history and present and future that we want to make emerge more for all of us.
That's great. Yeah. And yeah, it's very true. You know, the past, indigenous cultures like in Australia, the past is the future in a sense.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
there's that linearity or is totally put aside. So I think that's terrific. Well, last question for you then, if you don't mind. What would you advise people who are getting into futures? What would be a something that you think might help them as they enter this world of futures thinking, futures practice, whatever it is for them?
Yeah, I think it's very easy to learn the methods, right? So you read a couple of toolkits, you're going to see a lot of repetition between them, some differences between one method and the other, but this is easy to learn. I think the challenge and the most interesting part is really in the understanding of the intentionality behind the tools.
Yeah.
Why am I creating this? Am I creating this like for a company to kind of like map the futures, get there first, influence everyone else to go in that direction so that company earns more money than the rest of the world? You know, are you really trying to serve this objective, or are you really using your critical thinking to make the world a better place? You know, so I
Yeah.
think this kind of critical sense on why are we using futures and foresight with the intentions and who's participating, whose voices are in the room, you know, which perspectives are we considering, which notions of time are we taking into account here? What are the assumptions? And the assumptions are always present. The biases are always present. So we
Yeah.
need to spot them. And then you can use whatever tool you want to facilitate the conversation, you know. This is less important in my view. But really understanding the assumptions and the biases behind it and the intentionality and who's in the room, those are key components for us to be a futurist for the good of the world.
Great advice. I love it, Thays. I want to thank you so much for giving us this time. And I hope we'll get you back and have another chat.
Yes,
So thank you.
absolutely.
Any last words before I just say bye?
Yeah, I think my last words, because we're so concerned right now with the state of the world. I just came back from the Commission on the Status of Women, and I was seeing a lot of activists and a lot of member states being quite progressive on their discourses on gender and climate, for
Mm,
example, and poverty alleviation and things like that. So I encourage people to go. not just look at their signals in social media and media right now, but really go out and talk to people and be in different stages, because there are many other signals emerging and many seeds of the future who are already present that we are ignoring and just like buying into a kind of a mainstream discourse that is not helping us move towards the future we want.
Yep, fantastic. I bid you farewell. Adios, as they say in.
Adios. Thank you so much, Marcus.
Thank you.